Welcome, everyone. I'm Jenny Kwan. I am the co-organizer of the STR teaching events with my partner, Nathan Furr. Thank you so much for coming and thank you for your interest. Today's topic is teaching-inspired research and research-inspired teaching. And we have three fantastic speakers today: Rahul Kapoor, from Wharton, Olga Hawn from UNC-Chapel Hill, and Jeff York from Colorado. So what our plan is to start with some brief opening remarks from our chair-elect. So that's Deepak Somaya, and then some announcements from Juan Santalo. So Deepak, thank you so much for helping us with this, and take it away.
Thank you, Jenny. Welcome everyone to this virtual teaching session, teaching workshop. Thank you for making the time to be here. It's a real pleasure to sort of offer this series to you guys. So my name is Deepak Somaya. I'm the division chair-elect for the STR division. One of my responsibilities in this year has been to oversee the teaching committee. And just for some context, the teaching committee oversees 4 different teaching-related activities, one of which is this online series, the other is the website, and then we have both the teaching consortium and some teaching PDWs. Those are 2 separate activities that we do at the conference itself. Each of these are essentially organized and orchestrated by 2 of our teaching committee members, and Jenny and Nathan are the ones doing the online series. Thank you both for making this such an incredible success. But also helping me oversee all of these activities is Juan Santalo, who's been incredible in that role. And more than anything else, this is just my opportunity to say thank you to all of the volunteers who helped make this happen. So thank you guys. And Juan, over to you.
Okay, so thank you so much, Deepak. I thank you, the speakers, for participating. Thank you so much again to Jennifer and Nathan for organizing this. Just a brief announcement, right? So I put on the chat the address of the STR teaching website, because Felipe Monteiro and Paul Sivan have done a fantastic job updating these resources for our teaching materials. We have new sections linked to teaching AI. We have new syllabus. We have new videos. So I would encourage to everybody assisting to this session to go and check what are the new materials that I think can be really, really useful for improving our classes. So thank you again so much to Felipe and to Paul. That's all. So thank you. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Juan, and thank you, Deepak. So here's our roadmap for the rest of the hour. We're going to start with some context here. I also want to thank Juan and Deepak for all their help putting this all together. So the topics that will be covered include how research and teaching interact. So we have, in our daily jobs, pressure to do both. And are they actually complementary, and how has that worked out in your experience? Maybe some research projects that have been inspired by teaching, and maybe do you use your own research in your teaching? So these are all different ways that research and teaching can interact. So each panelist will speak for about 8 minutes or less, and that'll leave us plenty of time for Q&A. So that's the plan, and we're going to go in this order. So we'll start with Rahul Kapoor, who is the David Houck Professor of Management and the chair of the Management Department at Wharton. Sorry about that, Rahul. He teaches at the MBA and PhD levels on technology and innovation, really incredible research in that area. He's won teaching awards and serves as an AE at SMJ, contributing editor at Strategy Science, and all of his work, the PhD, builds on his long experience in career in industry. So Rahul is going to talk about his research and teaching. We also have Olga Hawn at UNC-Chapel Hill. Her area of specialty is sustainability. She's also teaches at the MBA and PhD level, won numerous teaching awards, AE at SMJ as well, and is also a distinguished research fellow at the Keenan Institute, which is an institute about entrepreneurship and the economy. She did her PhD just down the road at Duke, and we'll be talking about her research and teaching in the sustainability area. And last but not least, we have Jeff York from Colorado, also does research and teaching in the sustainability area. He's also in the MBA and PhD teaching area, a faculty scholar. So lots of recognition for his research as well as his teaching awards, and board member at AMJ and Org Science. So really distinguished in the publishing and editing roles, and PhD in University of Virginia after a career also in entrepreneurship. So another startup founder. And so we're going to hear all kinds of perspectives, I think, research inspirations and teaching inspiration. So I'm really excited. So we'll just go ahead and get started with Rahul. Thank you all three panelists for being here. And I will now stop sharing so you can see our speakers and they can share their slides. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jenny and Nathan, for having me here. I hope you can see my slides. And
Yes.
What a wonderful initiative to really think through how we can integrate our research with our teaching. And so what I thought I'll do is, in the time that we have together, share with you, more of a, no pun intended, a case study of how I've integrated my research into the classroom. As Jenny mentioned, most of my teaching at Wharton focuses on technology strategy as an elective course. And in that course, I have 3 modules. The first module focuses on issues of technology development and commercialization. The second module focuses on issues of industry disruption, both from an established firm perspective and a startup perspective. And the third module focuses on issues of platforms. And what I've been able to do over the years, so my research has looked at how firms compete and create value within an ecosystem. And so I incorporate a lot of my research into each of those modules. I would say on average, my syllabus would have about half of the sessions would have my research being part of that conversation. And ecosystems is a big block within that syllabus. So what I'll do is I'll just give you a flavor of how I go about some of these integration. So, there are 2 themes that I would typically cover in pretty much every course I teach. The first theme would be how are ecosystems different from how we have thought about, let's say, value chains and supply chains. And even as an early researcher in the field, I used to grapple with these questions quite a bit through the peer review process. So what I ended up doing, after having to write a lot of response letters and saying things, I said, well, let's just put together in some sort of a primer. And Journal of Organizational Design was a wonderful outlet to create a primer, which wasn't a literature review, but just thinking through how are ecosystems different from supply chains and value chains. And I wrote that article in a way that it's it's not overly lengthy, and it's fairly digestible for an undergrad, an MBA, and executive education student, in addition to academics. So I assigned that reading for that session, and it's very much an interactive lecture where I'll have examples and we'll have some polls and questions. And then another block of my course takes on these core issues of technology strategy. I've written a Tesla case and that gets matched with the research I've done. Most of this session works off my research with Ron Adner. Back in the day, as Jenny said, I worked in semiconductors, and a lot of this came from that context. So we have a Harvard Business Review article that gets paired with the Tesla case. And then I include these two academic SMJ articles to give students, where does that HBR thinking come from? And it comes from the research, and I think that's important for folks to see. So that's, so I'll walk you through some of what I do in each of these sessions, and I'm happy to, take on any questions or comments afterwards. So I start with, just a basic definition. I'll do a quick poll of how people are thinking about ecosystems, and then I sort of give them sort of my take on it, set of factors contributing to a user value proposition, and the focal offer could be a product or a platform. And that becomes a starting point. Again, this is all in the article. I'm not going to repeat a lot here. And then I'll make it very clear that, what some of the key considerations in an ecosystem lens is we have multiple actors contributing to value. We have these economic complementarities, apps with the iPhone, but we also have these pipes and linkages of the system to work together. And those are structural, technological interdependencies as well. And as a strategist, you have to think about all three. You've got to think about the actors, you've got to think about complementarities, and you have to think about these structural interdependencies as well. And then I spend some time walking through, how supply chains are different from ecosystems. And when I show this visual of a supply chain, it's almost like an aha moment. There's a reason we call it a supply chain, because it takes very much a supply side view, and it doesn't quite have the demand side considerations of thinking about value, thinking about complementarities, thinking about platform-based models of value creation. And then I do the same thing with value chains. I go back to, the starting point for a value chain perspective. Michael Porter, you have this value chain. We have done this through multiple cases, whether it's Southwest or Dell or many others. But it's very much within the firm view, right? Thinking about what are the different value creating activities within a firm. And that helps us to think about, cost and differentiation, the value stick, as we call it. And it's a useful tool in terms of understanding how firms compete, and also where value gets added within the firm's internal set of activities. And then I, very quickly walk through an iPhone illustration. And an important sort of, point I try to put across is I'm not saying that, ecosystem becomes the only aspect that we care about, but to really show how these different seemingly similar sounding concepts are unique, but collectively they are important to consider, right? So the value chain is really important from Apple's perspective in terms of investing in internal R&D, marketing, distribution, very important choices that Apple makes, allows it to do what it does. Supply chain, and anybody who's gone through the last few years knows the importance of supply chain. But it's solving for a very different problem in terms of how do you keep your costs low, how do you satisfy cyclicality and distribution of demand over time. An ecosystem sort of says, what is the fundamental structure of value creation? Who are the actors that we need to bring together, and how do we sustain that value proposition, right? So I think that, for me at least, helps to bring home the point of, how are ecosystems different from supply chain and value chain, and not to say that one dominates the other, but they are focusing on different aspects of the phenomenon, different aspects of the strategic considerations, if you will. And then I sort of wrap this up with what I call the 3 A's within an ecosystem-based perspective. You got to think about the activities, upstream, downstream, bottlenecks. Nathan is here. Nathan and I have done a fair bit of work on that. Think about the different actors, suppliers, buyers, complementers, and of course, architectures. As a former engineer, architectures are a key part of how I look at the world, and thinking about the technological connections, hardware with software, different types of electric cars, batteries, and charging stations. And then we can think about it input-output level, and we can think about the architectural piece as well. So that's much of what I do in a 80-90-minute sort of lecture with cases and interaction with students. And then I have, the other section where I match some of those articles with a Tesla case that I wrote and I updated. And, Tesla's market value has been a big moving target over the last few months. This is an older number. Today is actually, 540 billion or so. And I think it's a story that's, very visible to everybody in the world of tech. I basically make a point that, what Tesla is doing with the technology is old technology, but a new ecosystem, right? The notion of electric cars has been out for, 100 plus years. The technology itself is not new, but it's how the system is being created that's new. And I frame that issue as very much around how Tesla has strategically managed the ecosystem bottlenecks. And that's a key premise of an ecosystem-based thinking. And then I, spend some time engaging with students about, yes, if we agree bottlenecks is an important consideration for technology strategy, how should we think about it, right? And we use electric car as an example, and we talk about Tesla. I kind of create this electric car ecosystem. We have some upstream activities, we have some downstream activities. And then we have a first screen on this, what are the bottlenecks and what are not the bottlenecks. And it's clear that, general suppliers of body and seats and airbags, they're not bottlenecks because they're plug and play into an electric car, but batteries, clearly have to improve. And we're talking about the emergence of Tesla. So this is 15 years ago, if you will. The charging infrastructure needs to be developed, still an issue, of course. Electricity grid becomes a bottleneck if 20, 30, 40% of all cars are electric, right? The tax on the grid is going to be high, and we need to think about that as a viable. And then, of course, we need maintenance for these cars as well. So as a first pass, I say, let's think about the green versus red. I don't have a yellow color. We just go with green and red for simplicity. And say, well, okay, there are 4 things that have to really change. You got to invest, you got to innovate for the value creation to take place from electric cars. And the 3 things we can plug and play, for example. But as a strategist, as a leader, you don't get paid to just come up with a list of things. You got to think about, what you should prioritize in the short term and how we should think about allocating resources over time. So then I sort of, pushed like, of all these 4 red lights, which do you think is the most critical bottleneck that Tesla should think about first, and how should allocate resources across the different bottlenecks? And you get different types of responses, batteries, charging stations, utilities. Some people coming from different backgrounds, different countries, look at it very differently. And then I, walk them through a process that I've developed. And I'm not going to labor the whole thing with you, given the interest in time. But essentially talk about, what's what I call a value challenge ratio, which is to what extent, if you solve that challenge, what's the effect on the value that gets created for an average user, right? So thinking about the weight that each of these elements have, if you were to improve them, how does that improvement translate into value creation for the user? And I, talk about some of these considerations. We have a quick table exercise. Most people would agree batteries and charging infrastructure are very high value creating issues. Grid and garages, maybe not so much, at least in the short term. But the challenge for batteries is very different from the challenge of building a charging infrastructure. A charging infrastructure, you have to work with many different actors across geographies. Batteries, you work with one partner, one centralized facility, significant but not as high. And then again, people can vary on these, but that's the process. And so if you look at the value challenge ratio, which is the highest benefit of solving a challenge across all these 4, you would say batteries for the most part, and then chargers, garages, and then grid. So that gives you one way of thinking about what's more important. But then I say, well, that's not really a systems analysis. That's more of a component analysis. Let's think about the system level interactions and say, how if you were to improve one makes the other more or less of a bottleneck. And I think that's where I start seeing some light bulbs in the class and say, yeah, that's interesting. And then I say, well, if you improve batteries, charging infrastructure becomes less of a bottleneck, right? Because your batteries can have more juice, you can drive longer, you don't worry about the charging infrastructure so much. But if you improve the charging infrastructure, then the utilities become even more of a bottleneck, right? So that's like an exacerbating effect. And we, create a simple matrix, put batteries, the different elements, columns and rows. And then the positives are like good interactions. Like I'm investing in one, but I'm also making other less of a bottleneck versus I'm investing in one, but making other even more of a bottleneck, which is a negative interaction. And so then the final analysis is really about how do you bring both of these, analytical pieces together. One focuses on the cost and the value, other focuses on the interactions. And then you bring these two together and it becomes very clear. Yeah, as a strategy, the batteries becomes the most important bottleneck to focus on, followed by charging infrastructure, followed by garage, followed by grid. And then I leave the students, with the final thought that depending on the market segment you focus on and where you are in the world, this analysis could reveal a very different result, right? So if you take a luxury segment, perhaps battery will not show up as the most important consideration, right? And then I wrap up with, just reminding people that when you're working on emerging technologies like electric cars, there are multiple decisions that have to come together around markets, around technology improvements, around ecosystem, and it takes time, right? So Tesla is, it's been 20 years since the evolution of Tesla. So that's a snippet of what I do in the classroom. I hope this is useful, and I'll pass it over to Olga. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahul. It's such a great example of, using your original research in your teaching and in a really accessible way. I think that's fantastic. Okay, great. Olga, you're next.
Thank you. I am starting to share my slides. Can you see them? Yep. Okay, perfect. All right, 8 minutes. So I'm very lucky, I think. Not many of us get to teach what we research. And I think that's where, my story begins, is that I'm both researching sustainability strategy, and that's what I teach in the core MBA at UNC. I also do it online. Plus, because of my interest in sustainability and social enterprise, I am actually running this global immersion elective. So every year I travel somewhere with 25 MBAs and we visit companies where I get inspired with what was happening in the world and in real practice, but also the students get the best experience that they can with this experiential learning. But what I want to talk about is my core class and sort of walk you through how I use a lot of research in my teaching. I do translate it, and that also the teaching itself inspires some of my work. So the class is mainly about this strategic management, essentially, of ESG issues, the core tools that I always remind the students to remember after the class are stakeholder analysis and materiality assessment. And it's designed sort of with my research in mind. So from drivers of sustainability strategy adoption and implementation to then the different degrees, shades of green or all this strategy, and then the different outcomes. And of course, for this area and strategy field in particular, all we care is about performance, right? So also, does it pay? When does it pay? I actually just taught the class on this very business case yesterday. So these are the two tools that I mentioned, and they again help students, help us strategy scholars prioritize among the different stakeholders that firms engage with in their business, as well as choose on what particular environmental, social, and governance issues they should focus, right? I wish this chart could be, collapsed somehow into one tool, but that would be multidimensional. And, we all know that we can only take 2x2s, no more than that. Otherwise, it's too complex. But as I said, this is kind of like my pipeline of research, and the courses very much follows here. It's laid out in more academic language, right? Like with all of the papers and whatnot. But it is from the drivers to then the different degrees of adoption and implementation of the strategy, and then the different outcomes, both for the firm as well as for society at large. And so I start my class really from the debate, right? So it's still happening in the literature. We all talk about Milton Friedman versus Ed Freeman. what's the purpose of the firm? And we actually, we start there, we debate these models of the corporation, the old sort of model of one way input output, right? Like essentially suppliers, investors, and employees provide capital for the firm, and that means that the firm works it out and essentially spits out a product for customers. But then we actually push those boundaries forward and incorporate all stakeholders and actually look at mutually beneficial relations. What came out of this is that, of course, this trade-off between profit and purpose. Initially it came out in actually a conceptual paper, and also driven by some of the roundtables that I sat in with practitioners debating, there are so many issues, there's so many stakeholders bringing these issues, like there are so many trade-offs, like we have limited resources, we can only pay limited attention to this. So how do we decide where to focus? And so this game that was produced by Financial Times based on our conceptual paper with some of the examples from the Financial Times, articles that they produce, is a great tool that essentially translates the research, but also gives me a tool to play with my students in class. So this is also what we do. I do it in teams when I teach online because they can do it together. I do it individually in my full-time class. And it again starts that conversation that keeps going, and that's just one of the trade-offs, right? And it's a core trade-off strategy class because, of course, performance is affected. And so that's where the class that I mentioned on the business case, so there's this framework that essentially looks at 3 types of benefits that could be generated from sustainability investments. I certainly teach that, but I also have 100 slides translating all of our research and strategy field. I start with a meta-analysis by Margolis et al. And I essentially say, well, on average, there's a small positive effect. But is that enough to know this? Is there more that we need to know? Is it enough to know that it does not destroy shareholder value, right? Like we still need to go forward, I guess, with the research understanding under what conditions does it pay more or less. But overall, on average, it pays. And that's what I want you to remember. So that is also, I think, helpful for them. And then we go through different papers, different research, identifying the different sort of mechanisms through which it pays, the different outcomes, employee retention, right, recruitment, customer sales, growth, and et cetera, et cetera. The ESG issues, though, and this is also because my students actually pushed me, they asked me, well, but which of these issues are the most important to companies? Like, is there one particular one that they get criticized a lot on? So that actually led me to pursue this work using the rep risk data across 28 of these ESG issues. And to answer the question, I essentially collapsed all the data that we got and trying to see, okay, which one is the issue that companies get criticized more the most. And as you would think of it from our own research, right, like Cinziana Trabanto's work and others, the impact on communities came on top with essentially 11% share of criticism where companies are directly criticized on this issue. So all of the mining, right, like it is in the news for sure. But so did others. And just again, this variation, that's where strategy comes in, right? Like, okay, it's not that they're not important issues, but some of them get less attention. And it could be because firms are actually behaving on those issues, or it could be because the stakeholders may not pick it up. So I will, I guess, finish with this slide. The key trade-offs is what we kind of discuss in the class. And again, some of them I'm inspiring some of my research. Others are just what companies are telling me that they're experiencing where they need help. We just hosted a roundtable yesterday with companies based in North Carolina, but all of them are struggling to answer these questions. And most of them recognize that it is a strategic question, to think about what resources and capabilities do we need, especially with all of these net zero goals that they've adopted and the deadlines that they have. So how do we measure? How do we report and disclose? How do we, what's the impact of all of these new regulations going to be on our business? So all of that is very strategic, and all of it is very much interconnected. And so with my students, I think, and with my PhD students now, I think drawing on both practice as well as, I guess, the research, the body of knowledge that we've already created, I think it's it's clearly, to me at least, that they're both inspiring each other. And I think like I'm lucky, I guess, to be in that field where I can do both the research that's inspired by teaching and also teach something that's inspired by research. Thank you. I'm gonna
Wow. Thank you so much, Olga. That's so interesting. And like, just, I didn't know about the FT game.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Like that. That's really great. So thank you so much. Jeff, you are next. Please
Great, thanks
take it
so
away.
much. Let's see. Okay, you guys seeing my slides okay? They
Yeah.
good? Right, hear me okay? Great. So this is great. I actually was just thinking as Olga was talking, I actually use Olga's research in my teaching. I show a video that she put out on one of her papers that talks about the various impacts of disclosing ESG initiatives and things like that. And so that's one thing I would say is like, I think using your own research and that of your colleagues and friends and people you know that are doing good work can really be powerful, especially teaching online. I particularly use that in a climate change for small to medium enterprise class. And it just brings more voices to the table, shows people, hey, researchers are doing all kinds of interesting things. It's not just me, you know, talking to you. So I find that really interesting. I actually wasn't thinking about that until I was listening to her talk. It's kind of cool because Rahul and Olga have talked more about the sort of how you incorporate teaching about the org level or even the ecosystem. Well, I'm going to talk about the individual level a little bit because I teach entrepreneurship classes, and this particular class is about sustainable energy, and we cover everything from individual knowledge, values, ideation, all the way through scaling. So we kind of cover the whole spectrum of individual, organization, ecosystem, industry. And this particular module is from a class where we're talking about just getting started. So it comes on the tail end of a class where I just introduce how do entrepreneurs think. And I use a lot of the work by Sarah Sarasvathy on effectuation to do that. So we do this really awesome case study about the ice hotel and how it comes about. And students are like, why are we studying an ice hotel in a class on sustainable energy? I'm like, well, you're not. You're studying how entrepreneurs think. And then I need to transition in the second module of that class. Okay, we've talked about this idea of effectual thinking. Now, how does that apply to sustainable energy? And so that's sort of where this module comes in. I use my research probably every other class or so, I would say. Anytime I'm doing a case, I've been doing stuff on sustainability and entrepreneurship for a long time, so I always have something I can build in. I think the key with all this is to not bore the heck out of the students. They really don't care about our research. They care about what our research can do for them. And when I give them the papers, I usually say, just read the abstract and the introduction and maybe the conclusion. And they tend to do that. And some of them will read more, so it just depends. And I'm going to go through this pretty quick. So we talked about effectuation, how we start thinking about as an entrepreneur, where do we actually start thinking about sustainability? And so I'm going to build from this paper that we published a few years ago, where we looked at how sustainable entrepreneurs or entrepreneurs engaged specifically in renewable energy think about this. And in that, we define the idea of environmental entrepreneurship as the use of commercial and ecological logics to address environmental degradation for the creation of financially profitable organization products and services, something we're all interested in this class. And what I want to talk about specifically, we want to understand, why do some people engage in sustainable energy development? And then how do they incentivize stakeholders? So hopefully this is useful to the students as they're thinking about their journey. Most of them aren't already in this industry. A lot of times they're coming from sort of a reset, either an MBA or a Master's of Environment program. And so long story short, I just try to summarize the study right here. People that do this are motivated by coupling between identities based in commercial and ecological logics. And I'm going to talk about what that means in just a second here. They prioritize economic versus ecological goals, depending on the strength and priority of the coupling between these two identities they hold. And what's important is they incentivize stakeholders in a broadly inclusive or exclusive way based on this identity coupling and goals. Now, what you can learn from this as a student is how you can, one, develop an identity that'll allow you to engage in this more effectively, and two, how to leverage that identity in going after stakeholders. So we usually think about the entrepreneurial identity as this: we create economic profits, risk tolerant, think whatever entrepreneur you like. In this paper, we're thinking about the entrepreneurial identity as one identity you hold. How many of you in the class, and I'm sorry, I'm reverting in my teaching mode doing this, but we're talking about how many of them hold these different identities, and that leads to them. So many of you may have been entrepreneurs. We'll talk about that. And we found people like that. So we put some quotes, just one illustrative quote. This was qualitative research. Here is an example of commercial identity. People that hold this identity tend to include anyone that can help them make money and get the venture off the ground. And that's great. Then we have people, we have people that are coming in our Master of the Environment program. Many of them come from policy and from NGOs. They tend to hold an ecological dominant identity. I'm only interested in this from the environmental perspective. And here's the challenge. We were interviewing people, and it turns out folks with this identity tend to not be as inclusive of others that they don't view as pure. And this is just an example quote. You guys can read it. But this guy was talking about hiring people from oil and gas. And if you're coming from a new industry and you're trying to make inroads against massive incumbents that are arguably the most profitable and politically connected companies in the world, you'd probably be smart to hire people from those companies, not exclude them because they are not pure in your mind. And by the way, this company failed, as did all the ones we looked at that came from the ecological perspective. Now, more interesting is the people that hold this, what we call blended identity. So multiple identities are important for them. And here's the thing, when you look at how they talk about how they incentivize others, they don't even know how they're doing it. So these are two founding partners. This one said, the mission for our firm is making the world a better place. I'm a father, I've had a heart attack. He talks a lot about how he's going to create all this wonderful thing for the world. And then we ask his founding partner, hey, why are you starting the company? I'm a problem solver. I want to be part of problem solving energy. I wouldn't be honest if I didn't say at some point sitting on the beach with my wife and child, and some of those financial rewards come with it. So he's much more focused on the financial side, whereas this other founder is more focused on the other side, the ecological side. And we found this pattern repeated. We had founders that said things like, my employees work for me because we have good stock options. The employees would say things like, I want energy independence for the United States. And so the point of this is if you can hold these multiple identities, then you can actually not worry about how you're incentivizing people as long as you're acting authentically. So then we do a breakout and the students go and they talk amongst themselves. Which one do you hold? Why? And would you be interested in changing that? And then I click through another paper where we talked about wind energy in Colorado. And I'll go through this really fast, just, lots of pretty pictures because people are getting sleepy at this point because I've been talking about research. But here's an example we talk about, and I have the students like pick all the identities they see in this quote out. And what they end up with is this guy's very successful entrepreneur, launched his company, sold it, launched another company in the same vein, did the same thing, took a wind model, moved it to solar, got sick of playing golf. He's now the Public Utilities Commissioner for the state of Colorado. When people hold, skip my animations. Well, that's all right. When people hold these multiple blended identities, they can actually move through multiple incentives. They see more opportunities and they tend to do better. So lessons for the students, be inclusive of all stakeholders. If you don't have one of these logics very solid, take on voluntary roles to develop that as part of your identity and look to add to your means by expanding your identity. And you can hopefully do this in the class. And that's basically the end of that module. So I just want to do a quick example. Happy to share more on that. And okay. Not letting me stop sharing. Sorry, I haven't been using Zoom lately. Okay, interesting. All right. Well, sorry.
Is it up at the top of your screen under view options, maybe?
Maybe. I'm just going to quit PowerPoint.
Yeah. Tell you what, I can share my screen.
I think that did it.
Oh, that did it. Yeah.
You did it. Yeah,
Yeah,
great.
sorry, I haven't been teaching since I got this associate dean job. I haven't been on putting slides since Zoom for a while.
Oh, I'm sorry, Jeff.
Yeah, it's all right. It's only a 2-year appointment, so it's great.
Oh, phew. Okay,
Yeah.
great. Fantastic. Thank you so much for that. I just love, like kind of the multiple identities thing, because normally, I mean, not normally, but sometimes you might think that's a deficit,
Right.
but anyway, and so you turn that around. So thank you to all the speakers. So now we have time for Q&A. So please, great, Deepak, go ahead, and anyone else, please, queue up. Awesome, take it away.
Wonderful. I'm glad I get to go first, at least in part because I get to thank all our speakers. Thank you very much. This was wonderful, really inspiring to hear you guys. We've heard quite a bit from, I think, each of you about how your research and others' research in the field has inspired your teaching. And I was wondering if you might provide an example or two of where your teaching inspired your research in a really impactful way.
I mean, I could talk about that a little. For me, most of that has happened through guest speakers. And the paper I was actually just talking about, part of the impetus of that was having the person I was talking about as a guest speaker in the class and him talking about the evolution of wind energy in Colorado. I think I do a lot of stuff. I mean, I moved to Boulder because I was interested in these topics, and it's easy to do this research here because there's a lot of activity. And so when you bring people from your local ecosystem into the classroom and, you maybe take them to lunch, you get to hear what they have to say, you get interested in these ideas. And if you're doing a qualitative study, you do a lot of snowball sampling, and those people can be very helpful in making introductions and getting that process going. So that's one example. I would say, for me, a lot of times it's interacting with guest speakers and hearing what's actually, and asking them what their problems are and trying to base your research in something that actually addresses what people in industry are interested in.
I can jump in. Yeah, I think it's, I mean, I've had both of these, directions in terms of interactions. In the early years, it was mostly research coming into the classroom. I think in the more recent years, it's, classroom also helping with the research. So as somebody who was talking quite a bit about, innovation and ecosystems, in 2010, 2012, increasingly students start thinking about, well, ecosystems are also include platforms, and what do you do with your research connects to research on platforms? And I didn't quite have a very good answer. I think I would make some extensions, but loosey goosey kind of a thing. And then I thought, let's find an opportunity to engage with platforms. Of course, Apple, Google in the smartphone wars was a very hot topic back then. Open close was a conversation taking place, and the discussions were starting to emerge that what Microsoft did to Apple in the PC, Google might do to Apple in the smartphone era with the open versus closed approach. And in some of the classes, I started having folks who had experiences developing apps for smartphone, and got some wonderful discussion about, how is it to develop applications for iPhone versus Android? Is it really open versus closed? Is it integrated versus fragmented? What does it mean to innovate? What does it mean to create value? And so, very blessed to have some amazing doctoral students here in the department at the Wharton School. And I thought, okay, let's see if I can find somebody to explore that. And so Shiva Agarwal came along, and she did her entire dissertation on looking at smartphone platforms and how app developers compete and create value, especially across these competing platforms. And so we've had a bunch of papers coming out of that. And what was nice for me to see is how much of what I was studying in ecosystems was, quite useful as we start thinking about platforms with some interesting nuances and boundary conditions. So I do think, it has helped me quite a bit in terms of taking research to the classroom and being pushed in terms of what else and how we can extend it, and then coming back and pushing the research forward as well.
I think I covered it with the simulation. I'm cognizant of time. I want to make sure everybody gets the question in. And plus, I guess very similar to Jeff, I actually benefited a lot more from my online students because of the introductions they were able to make. And I would bring those speakers then into my full-time class, which is also kind of interesting. Anyway, Nathan, go ahead. You
Nathan,
mute.
you're muted.
Yeah, we needed one of those, right? So, yeah, thank you. So, I have questions for all of you, but a pointed one for Rahul. I know, Rahul, you also did a course on the space industry, and I was just curious about how you manage that, because obviously that draws upon foundations in your research, but I could imagine there was like there could be a high cost to creating like this new course around this topic. So I'm curious how you juggle that balance between contemporary topic and course preparation.
Yeah, that was
And
a
describe the course to everybody. So
yeah, no, thank you for that, Nathan. And yeah, so this is during the pandemic where we are, 100% virtual, and so it was clearly a challenge in many ways, but also some interesting opportunities. And I've always thought about what are the new sort of empirical contexts that I could use in my research, in my teaching, and sort of learn about the world through that medium. And there was a lot of excitement around the space economy, if you will, about 5-6 years ago or 4 years ago. People were talking about SpaceX and Blue Origin and Virgin Galactica and others. But as I started to do a little bit of my own research, I realized, well, it's a lot more than that. And there are multiple aspects of the space economy, from telecoms to satellites to asteroid mining and space habitats and launch vehicles. So it's really exciting context to explore. And what happened was, because we were in the virtual mode, getting guest speakers was relatively easier. And so the first version of the course was very much comprising of, I would say, between 15 to 20 guest speakers, ranging from folks from NASA, from incumbents like Boeing and Lockheed Martin, to the startups like Rocket Lab, thinking about the VC side, how investing in space is so different from investing in, let's say, the non-deep tech, as we call it. Thinking about the role of policy, what's regulation piece versus investment piece. And I opened this class to actually all students, not just MBA, undergrad, executive education. And it was an extremely rewarding experience. We'll meet every day for 5 days for 3 hours. We'll have 4 or 5 guest speakers joining each day. And it was amazing how much I learned from that discussion. And I've done this every year now, except this year, to really engage with an emerging, exciting context, which is a green field for innovation and creativity. And actually, I've got many of our students who would typically think about Wall Street as a career, think about space as a place they would want to engage with as a long-term opportunity. And from all of that, I'm actually in the midst of initiating a research project looking at the evolution of the small satellites. And a lot of those initial questions and even data came from that course and having those guest speakers. So it's been a very rewarding journey, despite a fairly heavy lift setting this whole course up. Thank you.
No pun intended, Rahul. Heavy lift. That's so cool. Okay, we have Julia. Go ahead.
Thank you all for the presentations. My question is not directly related to what you just said, but it's a very broad question that is inspired by Professor Jeff York, and I will explain why, because we met last year. So I wonder if you teach the dark side of X. X refers to your research topic, like ecosystem, entrepreneurship, professional identity. So I asked this question because I actually met Professor Jeff York, I believe that's you, at a social entrepreneurship course last year that was held at Harvard, right? So you were one of the panelists, if my memory is correct. So at that time, looking back, I asked a very lewd question. I asked about the dark side of social entrepreneurship, and Professor Jeff York was the only one who answered these questions. And he talked about the transformations, changes in professional identity of workers in social entrepreneurship. So I just want to know that if you will try to teach the dark side of the of your research topic, because we all know that not everything is perfect. So are you afraid that there might be some unintended consequences of when you teach the dark side of some industries or your research topic? Yeah.
Jeff, you are on mute. Yeah.
Oh, well, I've already answered the question for Julia before, so I mean, well, sort of.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I think we're all going to need to be teaching about the dark side in the coming decade, because quite honestly, many people believe that AI is going to unleash amazing opportunities for business and probably going to do a lot of wonderful things for the stock market, but is going to potentially be devastating for many white collar jobs, including the ones we place many of our students in. So I think talking about psychological issues, mental health, challenges of managing, and even the challenge of just living in a world that's going to be, in my opinion, completely upended in the coming decade. I think that's really important. I don't think we should try to be therapists for our students. I don't think we're trained in that. And there are great people, at least on our campus, to refer them to for that. But I do think talking about failure, challenges, resilience, and innovation in the face of those challenges is incredibly important, because otherwise we're not painting an accurate picture of, at least in entrepreneurship, and I would say more widely in business, the kinds of things students are going to face. And that's tricky as a strategy entrepreneurship scholar. I usually want to defer that over to OB folks, but I don't think we should. I think we should talk about how challenges inform strategic thinking and resilience and success in the long run. Not always, but sometimes.
And I think of Olga with the trade-offs and things like that. You're a natural for
Yeah,
that.
I certainly, in fact, in my own research, I found findings that I did not expect to find, right? And still, that's what science is telling us. So I am still talking about it, and talking about it in class and talking about it in my papers. And yes, maybe it's an unexpected finding, even though, I would want to see more positive effects to CSR, for instance. But actually what I'm finding is that the attributions of corporate social irresponsibility hurt firms even more. So it's like there's always two sides to anything, I feel like, but there's no need to hide it. I think science is telling us that we are scientists. We need to make sure our students also know this, right, and understand it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Vijaya, you have your hand up. And you're on mute. Vijaya, do you have a question? Okay. So Vijaya is having tech issues. So maybe you could put your question in chat. And we could go to Nathan.
Yeah, in the meantime, I'll jump in and ask. I wanted to ask Olga about, given your deep depth of knowledge in sustainability. I don't teach this area, so I'm just curious. Do you ever run into struggles, either with MBA students or executives, in how you defined sustainability? Because it feels really challenging to define and like a moving target. So how do you define it? And do you feel like it's a moving target, or do you feel like you could,
Yeah. So we absolutely, like every course, I start with that, with a definition. And I always, because like once you say sustainability, people assume it's environmental. So like I have to tell them, no, actually it includes social as well as governance points. It's certainly, and that's why I actually start with, okay, what are ESG issues? And we like go one by one for all of the buckets, and then even look at cross-cutting issues that could be touching upon one or two or even all three across the ESG spectrum. So it's through the issues, it's through sustainable development goals, as another way I'm bringing that in to define it. And actually in my travel with students, that's how I identify companies we visit, is to cover all 17 of the SDGs, because that again helps them to get more. But yeah, maybe Jeff could add. I saw there was a chat.
Oh, sure. I mean, that's always the question. And
Yeah.
like, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you go to the Brundtland Commission and I kind of question that. So I actually try to get them off of trying to define sustainability and kind of point out that that's a bit of an echo chamber conversation that could go on forever. And rather to think about like, what are the key interests of the stakeholders they're trying to deal with? And how do we find ways to align those stakeholders? I mean, I do a whole module on this, like that's much more powerful to think about aligning stakeholder expectations in a way that creates more value than defining sustainability. So
yeah, I agree. Like there's no one good definition.
Right.
So like actually show like these are all, they all mean the same things. And yet like let's not get bogged down in the definitions. They all essentially try to describe those efforts of business going beyond, right? Like what's required.
Right. Exactly.
There's a Deepak's comment in the chat. And Deepak, I don't know if your question is different from the one in the chat where you wanted Jeff to elaborate.
No, it is. I was simply
go ahead.
responding to
go.
what Jeff put in there. And so one of the things I was thinking about in terms of teaching and how teaching connects with our research is when I look at our OB colleagues, for example, their students are very intimately involved in their research because they're often part of the lab experiment setup that they have. And I was wondering if any of you have had experience collecting quote unquote primary data, perhaps of a different type, perhaps survey data from your students. You certainly refer to qualitative data. All of you have talked about how, having guest speakers speaking to them and so on, having questions asked by students. Those have certainly inspired you. I can see that. But systematic quantitative data from primary sources where the students themselves are the primary source. And any insights you might be able to shed and, how well that works in terms of the publication process and so on would be great.
So I have a failed paper, but we did use a class to run, and not just my classes, but also in another university where we, and that was during COVID. So we tried to manipulate gender composition of groups. We were trying to link essentially gender to CSR effects, to what students would choose. And so we were giving them scenarios to play and allocate different resources. And then asking them to fill out the survey. And so we collected that data, and yes, our hypothesis held true, but we have not been able to publish that paper yet. So we don't have a positive story, I guess.
Yeah, I haven't done this myself, but I know my colleague Ethan Malik has been running these simulations and has, vats and vats of data that he's analyzing and has a couple of paper drafts, but I don't know, has it made it through the whole process. So it's definitely that those processes are in place, but not quite clear in terms of the outcome at the very end.
So I have a question, seeing there are no other questions. And this is going back to the comment Jeff made, and thank you for posting the paper. One issue that people have talked about is hybridity. So like having this profit motive and then the social motive, and it's, again, there's a trade-offs thing. But Rahul's talked about Tesla, and they're actually founded in order to address an environmental goal, which is to reduce global warming. And so in order to do that, they had to be profitable, right? They had to demonstrate this profitability. Do you think that could address some of the internal conflicts? Yeah, that's kind of my question.
Sorry, Jane, do you mean like within a firm or?
Yeah. The cognitive load of, profit and your other sort of environmental goal. What if these were actually combined because you have to be profitable to achieve the environmental goal?
Yeah, I mean, that's it's interesting because a lot of the stuff on hybrid organizing originally shows all these conflicting logics and people having challenges and struggling to get their company to work. And I've never met an environmental entrepreneur that talked about that. unless they were like heavily embedded in this like ecological idealized identity.
Mhm.
But what I've found, and I mean, I've written about this quite a lot actually, like that they don't see it that way. And that's actually, that paper was the start of seeing that they don't view these as conflicts or trade-offs. They've actually constructed the company, and not to say they don't find trade-offs as they work, of course they do, but overall they don't feel that conflict, and their stakeholders tend not to perceive it, because the more they do, the
Mhm.
more they address the underlying problem and the more money they make.
Right.
And this is a virtuous cycle. And I think we get in a lot of trouble when people try to be, again, pure.
Right.
And that's not my opinion. That's just
Yeah.
based on researching this over years, and I'm happy to point to
That's
work on
great.
that.
Yeah.
All right,
Sorry, I
maybe
was
we should
typing.
wrap things up here. And one of the things that I should also note, of course, is that these sessions are recorded, so the insights do live on in posterity, as they would say. So thank you all. This is a really valuable resource that all of you are helping create.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to thank all of our presenters. This is interesting as always. And thank you again, Deepak and Juan, for helping us to make this happen. It's been a pleasure for me and Nathan to put these together this year. So thank you all.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank
Great
Thank
session.
you.
All the
Bye,
best.
everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.